Hello guys, my name is Remik, and in today's video we'll talk about Dapper in .NET, what the Dapper is, how to properly set up Dapper in the .NET 8 Web API, and also we'll use the generic repository pattern with the Dapper itself. We'll also cover the more complex scenario that our tables and our columns will not be exactly the same code as we define this in our models. So we'll use the proper attributes in that case, and we'll set everything up to properly execute all the database statements. So if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, then please hit the subscribe button down below, write the comment, give me a like, and as always, now going straight into the code. Now the very short introduction what the Dapper is. So Dapper is in fact a micro-ORM that you can use in your .NET applications in order to perform specific database operations. And by default, it does support the map queries to the objects, but the rest of those is actually the key of the ORM, not micro-ORM. Here in Dapper, the key is the performance, and also that is the very lightweight library that you can install in your .NET applications. If you would like to check more features of Dapper, because in this video we would like to cover only the CRUD operations with the usage of the generic repository, then you can just go to the github.com. We have the very detailed documentation how it does work and what features are included in Dapper, and also the learn-dapper.com is the very good website just to cover more about Dapper. There are two Nugget packages that we'll use and install during this video that will help us to connect to the database and then also execute our SQL statements. So the first one is called Dapper to properly execute our SQL statements, and the system.data.sql client will help us to create the new SQL connections. Alright guys, as you see on the screen, I have prepared already one sample database that is called University DB. So we'll use this University DB that is running in the SQL server with this one sample table that is called university_students to perform all the CRUD operations with the usage of Dapper and also generic repository. Now, as you see, I have the sample data also inserted in my table, but the one key point here is the naming convention. As you see, for sure we'll not use the name that will be called university_students as the name for our model, and also as you see the first name last name is not properly written because we would like to use the attributes to assign the proper name that we have in our database, but our model will not look exactly like that. So with our generic repository, we will retrieve the specific value for the table name based on the attributes, and then we'll perform everything with respect also to the parameters and so on and so forth. So for instance, we can just start with creation of the one layer that will just keep our contracts and also our domain layer for the models, and I will just show you how to create the representation of that table with the attributes that will assign in our model. So I will just go and create two projects. So the first one will be called Dapper.domain, and inside of it we'll just remove that sample class, and we'll just create the directory that will be called entities, and inside of it we'll just create, and the name will not be university_students, but it will be the student.cs. And we have just to take a look once again that it was university_students, and of course we just can use the table attribute that we can just pass the proper name. So university_students, and also we'll just create all the rest. So it will look like this. So we'll just use the key attribute just to assign this as the primary key. We have also the attributes called columns, and inside of it we have the proper name. So we have the ID, first name, last name, email, underscore address, and major, and this is what we have in our database, and here we have the representation in our model. Now we'll create another layer just to have the contracts, so all the requests that we'll assign in our .NET 8 Web API, and the request will be to add the student and also to update the student. So we'll just create another class library that will be called dapper.contracts. And inside of it, we'll just remove as well this sample class, and I will create the directory called requests, and I will just create add student request.cs, and it will be the record type, and it will look like this. So it will be the public record. We are passing the first name, last name, email address, and also the major. So the next request will be called update student request.cs, and it will be the record type, and this request will be very similar, and we have to pass also the ID of the resource that we would like to update. Now we can assign the proper database connection string, our upsetting JSON file, and also with the usage of the options pattern retrieve this connection string in our persistence layer that we'll create in just a moment. So I will just create another section in our upsetting JSON file that will be called connection strings, and in here I will just use db connection string as the name for our connection string, and inside of it, because this is the SQL server, so we just have to assign everything. So I will just type server is equal to the local host in my case with the specific port 1433. Then the database name was university DB. I'll just close it up. The user ID for the SQL server, so for me is the SA, then the password, and the password is in my case strong SQL server password 1 exclamation mark, and then also will be the trust server certificate equal to true, and the semicolon at the end. We have our DB connection string in place in our upsetting JSON file, and now we'll create the persistence layer, and in here we'll create the options class, and then we'll assign this to retrieve this specific DB connection string in our options. So I'll just create this new layer where we'll keep our generic repository, so called dapper.persistence. Remove this class, and at first we'll just create the options directory, and we'll call it database connection options.cs. And now we have to define the key just to retrieve this specific section from our upsettings JSON. So it will be public const string database connection, and it was connection strings. So this specific section connection strings, and we have to retrieve DB connection string. So we have to create one property that will be called same. So it will be the public string DB connection string get set, and by default is the string.empty. And now in the program CS we have to get rid of this very sample code that was written for us. I'll just remove it completely. On this one. And now we'll just assign those DB options here just to properly able to retrieve this connection strings section and also the DB connection string value that is underneath. So we have just to type builder.services.figure, and we have to pass our database connection options. So we have to reference the project of the persistence, and inside of it we have to pass the builder.configuration.get section, and this section was connection strings, but of course we can use also the database connection options.database connection key. Now we'll focus on our generic repository itself, so we'll create at first the interface for our generic repository. So I'll create one directory inside of the domain, and it will be called abstracts, and inside of it we'll also specify which layer it applies to. So it will be the persistence, and we'll create the interface for the generic repository, so it will be called iGenericRepository.cs, and it will be the interface. Because it will be the generic one, so we have to pass the T as the type that will accept all the types here, and also we will just have to create the 5 methods. So the first one will be just to get all the entities, the next one will be to get by ID, then to add, update, and delete. So we'll just create the first one, so it will be the task enumerable of T get all async. Next one will be the task T that can be actually nullable, and will be the get by ID async. Now it will be the task that will return the Boolean value if the proper student was added or not to our database, and we'll just assign this to add async, and we have to pass the T entity, so the generic one. The next one will be just to update async, the proper entity, and all the last one will be just to delete async, also with the return type of the Boolean, and we'll just pass not the whole entity but the specific ID of that entity to be deleted. Now I'll create another interface that will be responsible for getting the SQL connection. So I'll just create one interface that will be called iSQL connection provider, an interface, and the only method that we'll have is just to return the SQL connection. So SQL connection get SQL connection, and we have to find this type in the nugget, and it will be the system.data.sql client. So I'll just install this here, and I have to import the SQL connection, and now we are able just to create the specific classes, so the generic repository and also SQL connection provider that will implement those interfaces. So I'll just create one directory that will be called providers, and we'll start with the SQL connection provider. So SQL connection provider.cs, and we have to implement this interface. So iSQL connection provider. We have to reference the project and of course implement missing members. And this class will actually create for us the new SQL connection based on the upsettings JSON. Just it will create the new SQL connection based on this DB connection string, and then we can use it in our generic repository. So I'll just inject our options that we have created here. So those database connection options. So I'll just type private read-only database connection options will be called options, and we'll initialize this in our constructor, but actually we would like to get not the database connection options, but options with the type of database connection options. And now we have to also install one more Nugget package that will be related to the options. So I will just find this type in the Nugget. So it will be the Microsoft extensions .options. So I'll just use this related to the .NET 8. I will install it. And we have to use this options, and those options will be not one-to-one the same as we have defined here, but it will be in fact the value of those options. So .value. And now in this method we would like to return new SQL connection that will have the options .db connection string, because here we are passing the connection string. So as you see, it's marked as the parameter, so we are getting this from our connection strings and the upsettings JSON file, so this long connection string to our SQL server. And now we have to declare our iSQL connection provider together with the SQL connection provider in our dependency injection container. So we have to type builder.services add singleton, and it will be iSQL connection provider and the implementation of it. So SQL connection provider from the persistence layer. Now we can finally create our generic repository implementation. So I'll create one directory that will be called repositories. And inside of it, I'll create generic repository.cs class, and we have to implement the associated interface. So it will be the iGeneric repository of type T, where T is constrained as the class. And we'll implement missing members. So all of those that we have defined in our interface. And as we see, we have not implemented exception everywhere. We know that everything will be asynchronous, so we'll just add at once everywhere the async keywords here and also there. And at first we have to think a bit what we will require just to perform the database operation. We can inject here our iSQL connection provider to be able to get the SQL connection. So for sure, in all of those methods, we need to have the SQL connection. So I will just create the private read-only iSQL connection provider, and I will just initialize this field from the constructor. And we can already create one line that for us will get the SQL connection. So it will be the await using var SQL connection is equal to the SQL connection provider that we have created, get SQL connection. And this line can be actually copy paste to all of those methods. Now, once again, going back to our database, we see that the first method will be to get all the university students. So all of those that we have in our database has to be retrieved and then returned by our .NET 8 Web API. So we have just to go to our generic repository and what we will require more to get all of those records from our database. So for sure, I will need the table name, but the table name that is exactly called university_students, not the student.cs or whatsoever. So we would like to create another class with the respective interface that will get for us the table name, but this university_students name. So in our student.cs, as you remember, we have created an attribute on the top of the student class. So we have to create the specific class that can return for us based on the T type, the table value, so the table attribute value, what's inside of it here. So I'll just create one interface that will be called entity attribute values provider, and it will be interface, and I'll just close this up. And for sure we would like to get at first the method to get the table name based on the T type. So we'll just get this specific table name that we have defined in our student.cs, so this one. So we have to create also in those providers the class that will implement this interface. So it will be entity attribute values provider.cs. I have to implement this entity attribute values provider, also the method that is inside of it. And now we have to think how to get the specific value. So we can just use following method. So the attributes, all the attributes will be the type of T that will provide, and we can use the get custom attributes. And the get custom attributes method will take as the parameter which type of the attribute we would like to check if our provided entity has exactly on the top of the specific class. So as you see, we would like to get the table attribute because in our student.cs we have the table, so it will be called table attribute. So it will be the type of table attribute, and also there is one Boolean value just to inherit, and we would like just to use this and set to true. So we have all the attributes that have the type of the table attribute, and we have to check if the attributes, so all of those, the length will be more than 0. So we have already this table attribute, then we are getting the table attribute, and it will be actually table attribute that will cast, and it will be the attributes, and it will be the first one, because we know that this table attribute will be assigned only once. If it will be assigned twice, then it's like the invalid usage of that get table name method, and also the assignment of those attributes in that generic repository case. So we'll just return in that case table attribute dot name. And in case of that will not have any of those attributes, then we'll just throw new exception. It could be, of course, specific, but I will use the normal one without any specific exception type. It will be the general one. So the table attribute is missing, let's say. And now we can go back to our generic repository.cs, and to get the table name, of course, we would like to get this from our class that we implemented this method just a while ago. So it will be the private read-only I entity attribute values provider, entity attribute values provider, and we'll just also initialize this field from the constructor. And now, just to get the table name, we'll just have string table name is equal to the, not this one, but entity attribute values provider get table name of the type T. Now, for sure, it will be applied to all of the database operations, so we can just copy paste this table name that will just get what was inside of that attribute. Now we have to remember that our table name and also the column name is different in our model and also different in the database, because as you remember, the student.cs has the column attribute with the value that is the representation how the column is called in the database. And now we have to know that this will not work with the proper mapping, because we'll actually select everything from the university students, but the Dapper underneath will try just to create for us the specific type. And now we have to create the one method in our entity attribute values provider just to retrieve the pairs of the column name and also the property name, just to have the proper mapping, just to properly retrieve the specific, in that case, students from database, and return all the values that we have in the database. So for instance, it will be the Charlie, Brown, and so on and so forth. So we'll just go to the entity attribute values provider and we'll just create one method to retrieve the column name value and also the property name. Now, as we discussed, I will just create the method that will retrieve for us the dictionary of the column name and also the property name. So it will be called get columns and model property names, and it will be, of course, the generic one, and we are taking as the parameter the @key argument, and by default it's true. But if you would like to create the new resource, so create the new student in that case, we would like to let the database to assign, for instance, the ID, so our key that we have in our student, that it will be auto-generated. So we would like not to include this ID in our dictionary. So I'll just go to our entity attribute values provider and I'll just implement this method over there. And now we have to think how we can approach this problem. So we have to take the values of each property that we have and also assign the property name that is defined in our student.cs. So we can start with getting all the properties. So at first we'll just type property info and it will be the array. So we have to import missing references here and it will be called property infos. And we can just take all of the properties based on the type of T and with the method get properties. After that, we'll just create the new dictionary that will contain the string and also the string as the value. So it will be the column name property name dictionary, and we have to initialize that dictionary, so it will be the new dictionary of type string and also the string. And now we have just to iterate through the whole property info array, and then we have to check at first if we have this attribute set to true, this argument, that we have to add also the key. So in that case, it will be the ID. And then we have just to take the value of the column attribute and also can take the name of that property. So I'll just use the for each in that case. So for each property info in property infos, and just for everything to be clear, can use the direct type here. And now we have to check if the property info dot get custom attributes, and now we are checking for the column attribute, so it will be the type of column attribute, and then we are using the true as the inherit, and we'll check if we have this attribute actually on our property info, then, and it is the column attribute. So now we'll just have the proper cast here, and inside of it we'll just check if we have this add key. So we have to include also the ID in that case, or property info dot get custom attributes type of key attribute, and also we have to use the inherit true in that case, dot length is equal to 0. So we don't have actually in that case any attribute at all in our property according the key attribute. Then we have to also check once again if the column attribute dot name is not null, then we are adding to our column name property name dictionary, we are adding the column attribute dot name and also the property info dot name. So in that case, we have just to take a look that this column attribute dot name will retrieve for us the specific value of the column attribute, and then it will also add as the value the property name. So in that case, it will be this ID over there. And with the first name, it will be as the key, and this one will be the value for that. And now we have also to declare the else in that case. So else we'll just throw new exception that column attribute is missing for property, and it will be the property info dot name in that case. And we have to, of course, return our dictionary out of that method. So it will be the return not here, but we have just to return this column name, property name dictionary from our method. Alright, and now we are able to retrieve the dictionary of the column name and also the property name based on the T type. So I'll just create the dictionary of string inside of it, and it will be called column name property name dictionary, and it will be equal to the entity attribute values provider, and then get columns and model property names. So I'll just pass the T type over there, and now we'll be able just to have the dictionary that will look more or less like this, that it will be the first underscore name, and we'll have the first name that will be retrieved from our student based on this, let's say, pair. So the value of the column attribute and also the property name. And now we have to think that maybe we can create another method just to create for us this whole select statement, just to have based on those column name, property name dictionary to create for us exactly this. So to take this first name as the key that is in our dictionary, to add between those two this as, so the alias, and then also this second part of the dictionary, so the value, and we'll actually do it in just a minute. So I'll just remove this, and now we can go to the entity attribute values provider, and we can define one more method. And this method will look like this. So it will be the get formatted string from the columns and the property names, of course, the generic type, and we are taking this dictionary that we'll just retrieve in this method, and then we are giving also the format string, because we'll have the case that we need just to take the column name that will be, for instance, the first underscore name as first name. So the format will look like for this key, so it will look like this as the format as, and then this value from this dictionary. But also when we'll just take a look on the update statement, for instance, then we would like just to have that the first underscore name is equal to the first name. So in that case, the format will be a little bit different, but we'll actually do this in the manner that we'll just provide the format of the string that will be an output from this dictionary. So I'll just remove this one, and we'll go to our class and implement this functionality. So I'll just go to entity attribute values provider, and I have just to implement missing members. And now we have just to take that dictionary, and the result out from that will be result will be string.join. We'll just separate this with the comma and also the space. And then as the second argument to the string.join, we'll just take column name property names dot select. So we have just to select what we have inside, and we'll just take column name property name, then the lambda expression, and then it will be the string dot format, of course, because we have provided the format for that, and it will be the format string, and then column property name dot key, and then column property name dot value. and out from that we'll just return the result. Yeah, so we are joining each one of that pair. We are selecting the specific column name property name pair, and then we are using the string format. We are passing the format string that we have as the argument to this method, and then we are passing the first one, so the key, and then the value, so the property name in that case. Alright guys, and now we can use this method in order to create the aliased column names and the property names. So I'll just write var will be actually the string aliased column names prop names, and it will be equal to the entity attribute values provider, then get formatted string from the columns and the property names of the type T, and inside of it I'll just pass this column name property name dictionary that we have retrieved previously, and then the format will be as we remember. Just to select everything we have to have the column name, then as, and then it will be the property name in our model. So it will be the 0 as and the value in that case. So it will be the key from our dictionary, and this one will be the value. And now we are actually ready just to get rid of this comment and to write var SQL statement is equal to select, then aliased column names property names, so it will be the select statement, then everything that we have aliased there, and then also the from, and we have already the table name retrieved here in the very beginning. So we have the full SQL statement, and now we'll just from that method return await SQL connection dot query async, and it will be the type of T, and we have to pass this SQL, but we haven't installed the Dapper in our project yet, so we have to do it. We have to install Dapper in our persistence layer, so I'll just manage NuGet packages, and I will just write Dapper. So we'll just install Dapper in the persistence layer, and now we'll be able to use this query async with the T type, and we'll pass the SQL there. Now we have to think how we can approach this get by ID async, and also the rest of those that we'll just check based on the ID. For instance, here to delete async based on the ID, we have to also create one more method just to retrieve the column name that has the key attribute, so is the primary key in that case, and also the property name of that ID or something else that will be actually pointing to the primary key. So we have to create one more method, and it will be the last one in that entity attribute values provider, and it will be called get key column name property name, and it will be the generic type, and we have to of course implement this in our class. So I will just implement missing members, and now we'll just use the simple for each just to retrieve only the specific property info that has this key attribute. So we'll just iterate through all of those property info in type of T get properties. Yeah, and inside of it we just have to check if property info dot get custom attributes type of key attribute is actually bigger than 0, I mean the length, so it exists actually, so we'll just use also the true for the inherit. In that case, we'll just use the length, and when it's like bigger than 0, so it exists, and property info dot get custom attributes, so the same method type of column attribute, we also need to have this column attribute as well, just to get the proper column name that we have in our database. So just looking at the student entity, in that case we have the key, so it will be found in that case, and then this column will be taken and the specific value inside of it, and also the property name will be returned from that method. So we'll just also use the true in that case, and we'll use the first or default is column attribute, and then if yes, then you are actually returning the column attribute dot name. So as you remember, this is the value of that attribute inside, so the column name from our database, and then the property info dot name, so the name of the property. So in that case it will be this ID, and if it will not be returned, then we know that we don't have any key attribute at all on any of our property infos, so we can just maybe throw the new exception that provided model does not contain key column attribute, let's say. And now we have everything in order to complete our implementation for the whole generic repository. So just to have the implementation of the get by ID async, we have to do the following. We have to take the table name, of course, as we have done already. Then we'll just take the aliased column names property names, so we can just take everything that we have declared in this get all async there. So we are using actually this column name property name dictionary, and also this aliased column names property names to retrieve the specific student, in that case from the database. And also we have to get the constraint actually that the ID has to be the same ID what we have in our arguments, and I see actually that I haven't done this in the declaration of the iGeneric repository, and of course we are just taking the ID. So I'll just go to the generic repository and I have to write int ID. That case, yeah, and now we have just to get the key column name and the property name, so it will be exactly what we have done in our last method in the entity attribute values provider. So it will look like this. So key column name property name is equal to the get key column name property name. And now we'll just take the key column name and key property name out of that. So I will just assign this to the column name property name in that case, and like the var key column name is equal to the key column name property name column name, and also the var key property name is equal to the key column name property name and also the property name. And now we are actually ready to create our SQL statement. So var SQL will be equal to, now it will be the select as before, so those aliased column names property names from our table, so the table name what we have in our database, not in our model, and then where this key column name, so where in that case the ID and ID are the same, but it could be different, is equal to the parameterized key property name. And in that case, we'll just retrieve the specific value in that case. So, and this value will be assigned in the dynamic parameter, so var parameters are equal to the new dynamic parameters, and we can just add that the parameters, and it will be called key property name, but this sign has to be inside this key property name. Will be the value of it will be the ID that we have here in the argument to our get by ID async method. So in that case, we can just return await SQL connection dot query first or default async with the specific type, so the type of T, and we are passing our SQL statement and also the parameters, so our parameterized query will look like this. And now we have to add the specific entity to our database. So once again, we have just to take the column and also model property names dictionary as we defined over there as well, but we have to use this add key and set this to false because we don't want to actually add the ID. ID will be generated in our database automatically because it's auto-generated in my case, and it should be auto-generated by the database in that case. So also we have just to define the SQL, and the SQL will be a little bit different. It will not look so generic as before. So we can just insert into a table name. So we have the table name already, and now we have just to take insert into what kind of columns and also the values after that, and then we have to pass the values. So we'll just take the string.join. In that case, we'll use the comma as the separator, and we're actually using this column name property name dictionary to get the keys. So as you remember, the keys in that dictionary, so as is actually called, so is the column name and then property name, so all the columns, so what is defined in the database actually. So we'll take all of those columns, but we are excluding the key, so we will not assign any ID case. I will just use the parentheses as well, and then I'll just type values, and the values we have also joined somehow, so we'll use the same string.join, but I see that we need the $sign in that case. String.join, not helping all, but all right, string.join, and we are taking once again this comma with a space, and then the column name property name dictionary. We have to take all the values and then select all of those values, and then property name be actually the $sign, and inside of it we'll use this property name. So I will just move this a little bit for you just to see what is going on. Actually, there. So we are taking all the values. So the values in that case are the first name, last name, email address, and major. But we are assigning this sign in front of that property name. It will automatically take the value what we provided in our entity. So in that case, we have the parameters and also we have the value after that. So we'll also need to execute this query just to add the specific entity to the database. So we'll just take the boolean rows affected and it's equal to the await SQL connection dot execute async, and we are taking the SQL and then we are providing the entity and we'll just return rows affected, and the rows affected will be the, it will not actually be the rows affected, it will be the int, and the rows affected will be higher than the 0. If yes, then we are getting the response from our database that we have the 1, and 1 is that it was successfully executed and our addAsync method properly was executed against our database. Now we can take a look on the update statement. So we have already the table name, and now we have to take the column name property name dictionary, but with the flag to false, because we would like to update everything except for the, of course, the primary key. So also we are getting the key column name property name just to have the where this ID is equal to the ID that I have in my entity. And now we have to use the method, but with some kind different format string alias column names property names, but actually the format will be not with the as between the first element, so the key of the dictionary and value, but it will be different. Now we'll just have, instead of it, it will be the equal sign and then it will be parameterized. So we'll just use this sign in front of the value of this dictionary. And now we are actually ready to write our SQL. So it will be var SQL, and inside of it update table name, set alias column names property names, where, and now where this key column name property name dot item 1, or just the column name, is equal to this sign, and also will be the key column name property name, but the property name in that case. And now we can just write var rows affected await SQL connection dot execute async, and we are taking the SQL and we are taking our entity, and we will just return from that method rows affected is higher than 0, so it was properly executed against database. And now the last method, so the delete async, so it will look as follows. So we are taking the table name, of course, we are taking the key column name property name because we would like just to delete some kind of entity based on the ID. So we are retrieving the key column name and the key property name, as we have done before with the get by ID async method. And now var SQL is equal to delete from, of course, the table name that we have retrieved, and then where key column name is equal to this sign and also the key property name. And in that case, we have to also add the parameters. So parameters are equal to the new dynamic parameters. And as we have defined where it was in the get by ID async, we have just to take the ID from our arguments. So we are just assigning the key property name, and then based on that, this ID will be passed as the parameter. And now we'll just return await SQL connection dot execute async. We're taking the SQL parameters, and it will be higher than 0, just to make it a little bit shorter at the end of that generic repository implementation. Now we have to also add our entity attribute values provider into the dependency injection container, and also we have to add the iGeneric repository and the implementation generic repository, so the actual class that implements this iGeneric repository of type T. So we'll just write builder.services.add singleton, and it was entity attribute values provider, entity values provider, and we'll use this builder.services.add scoped, and side of it will be the type of iGeneric repository and the implementation, so the type of generic repository. And now the final part, we have to define the endpoints for our students. So I'll just create one directory in our API that will be called modules, and inside of it I'll just create student module.cs, and it will be the static class, and in here I'll just use public static void add student points, and will be the extension method for the I endpoint root builder. It will be called app in that case. And now we would like just to get all the students. So app map get, and the root will be API students, and I'll use the async keyword here, and we have to inject the iGeneric repository of type student. Student repository, and inside of it var students are equal to the await student repository dot get all async, and we are returning the results dot OK, and we are returning the students that we retrieved from our database. The next endpoint will be just to get the student based on the specific ID. So I will just take this declaration, use this once again, but we'll just modify this a bit. So it will be also with a slash and the ID that will be passed to this endpoint. So we will also need just to have the int ID in that case, and we'll actually returning the student that can be null as well. So await student repository dot get by ID async. We have to pass the ID, and then we can just return student is equal to null. If is actually null, then we're gonna return results dot not found. If yes, then results dot OK with the student retrieved from the database. Now we'll just take a look on the delete endpoint because it will be very similar to that one. So it will be the map delete students based on the ID, but it will be the delete async. We are passing this and we are getting the Boolean value. So bool result, and now we have check if the result is true or not. If actually true, then we are returning the results dot no content. If it was not found actually, or something went wrong, then in that case we will just return results dot not found. So it was not found based on the specific ID. Now we're gonna cover the post endpoint. So app map post to create the student. So it will be API slash student and then async. And inside of it, we have to declare that from body attribute, we have to, of course, import it, but until I'll not write everything, it will not be possible. So maybe now I'll be happy to just take this one. And as you see, now I'm able to take this import. So we are just taking the add student request from our body and also the generic repository. So I'll just import also and reference the contracts. And now we can actually create the student based on this request. And then when actually everything went fine, we have the Boolean result from that add async, then we can just return result if it was properly processed. So it will be the results dot created. If not, then be the results dot problem. And the last one is the update statement. So I'll just shorten this a bit, and we see that is the put statement, and we have the API students async, of course, update student request, and we are injecting the student repository. So I'll just take everything as should be. So we're taking the student from our update student request, and then we're actually doing the same as here. So we are getting the result, but we're using the update async. Also, we are passing the student here and return result. If it was properly done, then results dot OK, and we can pass the student. And if it was the problem, so the results dot problem. And now we can add those endpoints in our program CS. So we can just, after the HTTPS redirection, we can just use app add student endpoint. So our extension for that iEndpoint root builder. I'll just remove this using that was not actually used, and we can run our API and check if everything went fine. So now once we have our Swagger up and running and the whole app, we can check one by one if those endpoints work or not. So I'll just execute, and as you see, to get all the students, we retrieved everything from the database. We have the IDs, first name, last name, email address, and the major with the proper values from the database. Now, I would like just to get specific entity, so based on the ID of 3, so the Charlie Brown should be retrieved from the database. So I will just use the 3 in that case and execute. As you see, everything went fine as well, and it was properly mapped as well. So now I'll just go and I'll just update this Charlie. So it was the 3, and we can just use the test for everything over there. I'll just execute. As you see, it was properly updated. We have 200 OK response in that case. And even we can just go to our database and we can refresh our data just to check from the database point of view, not from our Swagger. So I will just refresh this view. As you see, the proper operation was done. We have the test, 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 and test after updating the specific entity. And now we can just create one new student, and after that we can just remove that student. So it will be the post. So the first name will be, for instance, the 3Ws. Let's copy that value and we'll just paste everywhere. I'll execute. We have the SQL exception that we have the incorrect syntax near major. So in that case, we have just to go once again to our generic repository and check actually why. So generic repository, add async, and what should be wrong in that case? The wrong syntax near the major. So we can just take a look on that, how our SQL statement will look like. So I'll just execute, and as we see, insert into student, first name, last name, email address, major, values, and yeah, as we see, we have forgot just to add the parentheses at the end of that statement. So of course we have just to add this over there. We'll run once again our API. And now when we'll just try it out, we'll just use once again 3Ws, and now we'll execute. As we'll see, the SQL has the parentheses at the end, so it should be properly done. We have 201 created response, and now we can just go back to our database view, and as you see, we have created properly this resource. And now, as the last part of that video, we will just remove that student completely, and I will just assign also the breakpoint for you just to see how it will behave. I'll just remove this and this from the view, and the last one is just to delete async. So we'll just execute just to remove, but yeah, what was the ID actually of that new resource? We'll just execute and check on our own, of course. ID 14, so we'll just use 14, execute. As you see, the SQL looks like this, so delete from university students, where ID is equal to the parameterized ID, so this ID 14. So we are adding this dynamic parameter and executing async against the database. I will just resume the program, and as we see, we have 204 response, no content. So it was actually removed from our database. So I will execute once again to get all the students from the database. And as we see, we have no longer this ID 14 in our get async response. So everything is done properly. And just to summarize, I will just maybe update the student once again. I will just assign the breakpoint for you just to check what are actually the values for all of those properties. So I will just take the breakpoint here, and we will just update once again, try it out. It will be, let's say, the 13 ID, and I will just assign that value everywhere. Execute. Yeah, and now, as you will see, we have the table name, university students. Then we have the dictionary of all the pairs. So first name, last name, and so on and so forth. So those key value pairs that we retrieve from our attributes and also from the actual model that we have created for that student. Then we have the key column name, property name. So the ID is actually ID. Yeah, it's completely same. And then alias column names, property names. This is this statement. And now we are combining this SQL statement just to take table name, alias column name, property names, and it looks like this at the end, with also the where statement at the end. And now we are passing the whole entity, and as we have seen before, yeah, everything went fine.